Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful, wonderful turnout. Welcome to the side event titled Children with Disabilities Shall Not Be Left Behind, Examples of Good Practice and Challenges in Inclusive Education. Today we will hear from an excellent set of panelists about what is happening in the field. We know that we recognize that inclusive education is a fundamental human right, and that is well articulated in Article 24. We also know that inclusive education is indispensable for achieving sustainable development. And again, that is well articulated in SDG 4. My name is Charlotte McLean Nhlapo. I'm for today's session. Just a quick note on some work that we've kicked off at the World Bank, and then I will turn to the very esteemed panel. The bank has just launched an initiative called the Inclusive Education Initiative. This is an initiative that's a global initiative that will look at bringing inclusive education to scale. The initiative is funded by the government of Norway and the government of the United Kingdom. So I just wanted to start off with that as a teaser of what's happening on the ground. We can come back to that when we have a Q&A, but let me get to the panel because we have a few speakers and I want to make sure that they all have the 5 minutes allocated to them to make their presentations. So without further ado, I will pivot to the opening speech. And the opening speech, we will start off with Nora Eklöf from Youth of Accessibility Network in Sweden. So over to you, Nora. You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am honored to welcome you to this side event about inclusive education for all. My name is Nora Eklöf, and I am the Secretary General of the Swedish Youth Federation of Mobility-Impaired. I also represent the Swedish Youth for Accessibility Network. When I went to school, I was always told that I had a right to dream as big of my future as my classmates, that I had the same opportunities and possibilities, and that I was equal. The most important precondition to make it possible for me to attend an ordinary school was the access to a personal assistance for pupils and students. Without that student's assistant, I would not have been able to go to school on the same conditions as my friends. But I did. So in line with the ambitious Swedish policy for inclusive education, I had the opportunity to go to school and to university studies. Having the experience of and merit of university studies is more important for a young disabled person than for others, not least when competing in the employment sector. In Sweden, there are still challenges to secure a fully inclusive school. We have still some false and preconceptions to work with. For example, in Sweden, you have the right to choose which school you want to go to, but not all schools are accessible enough for students with accessibility needs. Private schools even have the right to say no to disabled students because of the costs of providing a student assistance or mobility aids. Hence, the freedom of choice for pupils and students with disabilities is restricted in comparison to their able friends. Inclusive and accessible education does not only benefit the student, but also the classmates, the teachers, the school, and our future society. It is a human right. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak here. bringing this topic to the table here brings hope for the future, and I am looking forward to listening and learning from good examples and reflects on what can be improved. I have high expectation that our countries can come together and create a world where disabled children are not left behind. Thank you. Tack.
Thank you, Nora, very much. That's a great way to kick off this panel. You raised some really important issues, that inclusive education does not just benefit the student, but more importantly, I think we're grateful for you and for your presence. So thank you very much. So our next speaker is the Secretary of State, Jan Christian Kolstrup, and he's from the Ministry of Culture from Norway. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Dear participants, it is a pleasure for me to have this opportunity, together with Nora, to hold the opening speech at this side event about children with disabilities, where you both will share examples of good practice and look into challenges as regards inclusive education. Education must be based on a solid fundament. It must be knowledge-based, and therefore we need good research and good statistics. We need teacher training of high quality that gives future teachers in kindergartens and schools the competences needed for bringing inclusive education to the next level. We need to be inspired when things go well, and we need to find out when there are challenges, identify them, and decide how to move forward. Education is no longer a question of national interest only. Education of today and tomorrow is about sharing knowledge across national borders and across disciplines. Countries are participating in international studies and projects, in cross-country research, in cross-country organizations, international conference, etc. We learn from each other, and if needed, we question what we hear. Inclusive education means social inclusion, pedagogical inclusion, and physical inclusion in practice. All should experience good learning possibilities throughout their lives. Good teachers are therefore essential. Teacher education programs should all emphasize adapted education and inclusiveness. It is also recognized that other professions than teachers also are valuable. Cross-sectorial cooperation is on the agenda in many countries. Norway has some ongoing research on how multidisciplinary teams around pupils in schools should cooperate, improve learning environments, and support pupils' learning. Today, we will hear of good examples. Examples may also be found on several websites where good examples of inclusive education in practice are shared. Technology can bring inspiration to a wide range of stakeholders in an effective way. Then, it is of high importance that these examples also are evidence-based and reflect research. Too many children with disabilities do not have access to quality education. There are also differences in the access to technology and digital learning tools in education. We must ensure that everyone gets the right to education and also joins the digital journey, regardless of their backgrounds. I fully support the statement theme for this side event. Children with disabilities shall not be left behind. I wish you an interesting session. Thank you for listening, and I now give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Some very important messages there. I think some key ones are the importance of high quality of teacher training. I think a very important message that came out of your remarks was that education is no longer a matter of national interest, and I think that's resonates very well with this congregation here, and the importance of good teachers and having cross-sectoral approaches. And this is an excellent pivot to get us to the next part of our discussion, And that is to really look at some good examples, what's really happening in the field. And to kickstart that, we will start with Anita Irby, who's from the Ministry of Children and Social Affairs in Denmark. Anita.
The Danish experiences regarding inclusion of children with disabilities. I will focus on the youngest children, and namely on two aspects of inclusion in early childhood education and care, also called EC-EC. First, on how we in Denmark ensure access for families with children with disabilities, and second, on how we create the best conditions for inclusive pedagogical practice in EC-EC. In Denmark, access to EC-EC is a right for all children, also children with disabilities. We believe that it's the responsibility of the state and the municipalities to provide specialized guidance, care, and financial resources. In Denmark, all children have equal access to EC-EC from the day they turn 6 months. This means that 90% of children between the ages 1 and 2 attend EC-EC, and this number increases to 97% for children between the ages of 3 and 5 years. In Denmark, the guiding principle is that children with disabilities should attend EC-EC together with children without disabilities to the furthest extent possible and with the necessary support for the child. It's the responsibility of the EC-EC institution and the municipalities to make sure that the EC-EC is accessible and adapted to meet the needs of the child. Furthermore, that the child has access to specially assigned pedagogues, technical aids, which match his or her needs. However, even with extensive support, some children with considerably and complex disabilities cannot be included in ordinary EC-ECs. Therefore, the municipalities offer special daycare facilities for children who are in need of special support and treatment that an ordinary daycare facility is not able to provide. Approximately 750 children with disabilities between the ages of 0 and 6 attend specialized daycare. That counts for only 0.3%. The remaining children with disabilities attend general daycare. And in addition to the support given in the EC-ECs, families with children with disabilities have access to different kinds of support and services in the home. This is always provided by the municipalities on a specific and individual assessment of the child's need for assistance. High-quality EC-EC can serve as an important measure of social inclusion. Therefore, we need to invest in it and prioritize it. If we want to create the conditions for inclusion in EC-EC, we need a common understanding of what is it that we work for. The goal of inclusion in Denmark is that every child feels welcome in the children's communities and that we create equal opportunities for all children to learn and develop. And this means that the EC-EC institutions have an important task. This means to know how to navigate the balance between problem-oriented and resource-oriented practices. The pedagogical staff should actively support the participation of all children, making sure that every child is intellectually stimulated, that every child has friends and can solve conflicts, but at the same time organize activities taking into account the special needs of children with disabilities. Another aspect of the important work on inclusion is to teach the children the value of diversity. This so-called inclusion competences are vital, which are important for children's lives both in EC, in school and onwards. I think we'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anita, for raising the important issue and sharing with us the Danish experience, which really emphasizes starting early and making sure that EC-EC is inclusive, or otherwise known as ECD is inclusive. So thank you very much for that. So we've heard from Sweden, we've heard from Norway, we've heard from Denmark, and now we go to Finland. And here we're going to hear from Thomas Thur, and Thomas is from the Threshold Association in Finland. Thomas, you've got 5 minutes.
I think, 5 minutes it's a very short time to explain Finland, but I'll try my best, yes. I've always been short and tried to do things in a short way. So I think the number one thing is that we have lots of good principles and good ideas in Finland. Finnish disability, I've been involved in the Finnish disability movement for about a decade now. Actually, I wouldn't be here without our mentor, the late Kalle Kankola, who was mentioned, is this on? Yes. Who was mentioned very well by the speech yesterday, and we're holding an event on memory of Kalle tomorrow. if you look at the basic principles of Finnish disability policy, they are rather well for children with disabilities. Children with disabilities should be living with their families, going through mostly the same schools with their peers, and the CRPD should affect how we see disability as a society, as a social model. Equality, participation, necessary services and support, and so on. So I think I would rather start with the challenge section. You see, understanding Finland requires to understand our system of many different municipalities. You see, in the Finnish law, the law directs us to do certain things. The law directs disability benefits. The law directs disability services. But often the provision of those services, arranging special education, arranging so-called inclusive education, arranging education, providing personal assistance, providing disability assistive devices, providing cost of living adjustments, most of those things fall to the more than 300 municipalities in Finland. So if I would need to address challenge number one, the fact that Finland has had more than 300 municipalities providing these services means there are more than 300 different experiences in receiving those. This has been a very imbalanced situation. When I would say that our current laws are very well in place, I would say the CRPD has affected our current legislation, and we have a new Minister of Education who started in her position 2 days ago. So I was asked to compliment her that she will be a great friend to the disability community already now in beforehand. One of the historical issues has been that there has been, through these 300 municipalities, lack of teacher expertise. So some people with special education needs have received very good education regarding where they have lived. Some people, in more rural municipalities, the level of teacher knowledge has been lower. I would like to point out that even we talk about inclusive education, to my movement, inclusive education has been very important. However, unfortunately, the way Finnish system has been structured is that if there are certain cuts to be made by the government, then often it's the municipalities that have to do the dirty work to decide where the cuts are going to be directed. And often they have been going to schools. And this has maybe led to a public discourse where inclusion isn't a cost-cutting measure. We shouldn't approach inclusion as a cost-cutting measure. The real inclusion means that we need a certain amount of assistance in the classroom. It means certain ratio per teacher per pupil. And since we have maybe started to wind down a little bit some of these basic principles, the term inclusion now in certain parts of Finnish media has become to mean chaos in the classroom. And this has led to this kind of anti-inclusion mentality. And the other issue I would like, even though our current laws are very good directing that all disabled children have the right to education, I would like to point out two physical barriers in the municipalities. For example, when I grew up in the early 1990s, I was able to walk considerably better than I'm now. Had I not been able to walk that much, I wouldn't be here today. Because I would have never gone to high school, I would have never gone to university, I would have never gone to the employments I've been given. Only because I was able to take the few steps, because there were no ramp-free, barrier-free schools within 100 kilometers. And this was 1993 in Finland, even though the law has stated everyone has the right to education in the 60s. So I think we're still struggling with the issue that our legislation is moving very well beforehand, and the practice is always a couple of steps behind. And I think it's very vital that we don't create any kinds of gaps so that we would receive even more ambitious legislation before we have actually realized all the gaps we have in terms of real access to education, which is, there are structural challenges, and I think we should be very mindful of those. Thank you.
Excellent, Thomas. Thank you, Thomas, for sharing with us some challenges around the capacities of the vast number of municipalities, and for debunking the myth that we can cut costs when we hold back on inclusion. In fact, it's the opposite, right? And also thank you for your personal narrative, because I think it serves as a good one to really amplify the gap between policy, legislation, and what happens in practice. We're going to stay in Finland, And we're going to go to our next speaker, who's Minna Karvonen. She is from Finland, as I said, and she is from the Ministry of Education and Culture.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think you might have some idea how it feels to talk after Tuomas. I mean, with such a fascinating narrative, and after this whole day of inspiring speakers, I've been kind of, deleting sentence after sentence of my examples, and I really feel like a humble civil servant now here when I'm trying to explain our system when you have already heard how it really felt. But anyway, that's my duty. That's what we do at the ministry. I will give you three very short examples from Finland. The first one is about amendments in legislation. The second one is about kind of follow-up and evidence base and how we try to learn from our faults and mistakes, although we can really change the structure in Finland, that we have autonomous municipalities that were referred to in Tuomas's speech, and there are 300 of them. So yes, we have our hiccups, but so have quite many other states. I would also like to say that it was wisely put when Tuomas said that actually legislation can be good, but what happens in practice is, well, it's kind of, how would I say it? It will kind of, make our cycling or walking or riding a little bit slower than I would like it to be, but that's the life. Sometimes it can be the other way around, that things happen in the world and we find, well, these practices are wonderful, and then we amend the legislation to kind of, and to mirror that reality that we already have. So, but anyway, about the two very small examples. The one isn't that small. The fundamental principle of Finnish education is to provide equal opportunities for learning and growth to every pupil or student. Educational support and special education play a very central role in its implementation. So our basic education system is based on the philosophy of inclusion. Basic education is the same for all. There is no streaming, but children are supported individually so that they can successfully complete their basic education. The objective in Finland is to integrate as many pupils with special needs as possible. And the proportion of pupils who have been partly integrated into mainstream education has grown in Finland. Amendments to the national core curricula for the pre-primary and basic education in 2010 included a systematic way of organizing support. The focus is on the very earliest possible support in order to prevent the emergence and growth of problems. Support for growth, learning, and school attendance is shaped into three categories: general support, intensified support, and special support. After several legislative reforms in recent years, there is now a continuum of the right to receive special needs education and support for learning in accordance with students' personal needs, from early childhood education and care to upper secondary general and vocational education. Next, I would like to highlight that all actions toward better inclusion must include impact analysis and reviews to help us identify development targets, critical points, and good practices. To say it simply, we need to be honest. One example of this kind of policy approach is that the government coordinates analysis, assessment, and research activities. We are being very strong believers in evidence-based. We work hard to gather information that is needed in setting policy guidelines and good working practices. And I'm happy to say, I'm not sorry to say, I'm happy to say that we have identified many challenges, or should I say problems. As I said, that we should be honest. For example, due to the loose governing system, so this is another way to put it, and Thomas was very frank with it, there are regional differences in how support is organized, and we know that. So there is a lot of room for improvement, for support and guidance offered for students in transition from basic education to secondary education and from vocational education to working life. We also need to ensure smooth cooperation between different service providers and education professionals. And what we do in Finland when we find these kind of challenges, we'll set up a committee. I think that there are quite many other countries who have the same kind of a solution, but that's not exactly a solution, that's a way forward and to build consensus. Finally, I would like to make some very few remarks about digitalization and accessibility. And this is something that I actually added today because this has been mentioned not that frequently during this conference. Advanced technologies can be used to promote equality and increase opportunities for social inclusion. And since we know that our societies are more intertwined, networked, information-centered, hopefully in the future also human-centered and digitized, we know that everything changes. The work changes, learning changes, education and teaching and so on. But if you want to benefit from this change, this really requires providing support for individuals who have difficulties in operating in digital environments. But on the other hand, we also have to make sure that everybody is equipped with broad base of competencies such as information literacy and digital skills within and outside the education system. And in this context, I would really like to say that we should really think about how to reinforce the role of libraries as environments for informal learning. One good example, and this is my last one from Finland, is our library for visually impaired, which is a state library and cooperates very closely with public libraries. And there are more public libraries than municipalities in Finland, actually, and also with university libraries and schools. And they serve persons with print disabilities, not only visually impaired. So, only some years ago, the only access point to our state library for visually impaired was the library itself and the library on the web. And since after this kind of new collaboration model between the schools and the universities and the public libraries, there are more than 2,200 access points to our library for the visually impaired, the state library. Where disabled persons with print disability can have access to the web-based talking book services free of charge. And with this new service model, providing much more opportunities for human dialogue and assistance if needed, especially young people use the services much, much more than before. In 2017, only 1,700 children and young people use the services of our state library for print disabled people. And in just a year after that, in 2018, we had more than 4 times more users in this age group because there was human interaction. That's the point. So we need that kind of contact, not only the web services. So that was it, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Mina, for sharing with us some of the fundamentals of the Finnish education system based on inclusion, and I think that's really important. And then sharing with us the 3 tiers of support around learning. That was a very interesting point. I think we really appreciate your candor, and thank you for raising the importance of using advanced technology and enhancing digital skills for inclusive education. So we're staying in the Nordic part of the world, but now we're going to go to Iceland. And here we have Thor Thoransson. Okay, thank you. And Thor is from the Ministry of Social Affairs in Iceland. Over to you, sir.
Of the Ministry of Education. We try to multitask in Iceland very often because we are so few. But the title is Education for All, Building Bridges. In 2016, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education performed an external audit on the education system in Iceland at pre-primary, compulsory, and upper secondary school levels. The aim was to examine how well the system of inclusive education serves all students. The main recommendation for the agency were to put forward as 3 interconnected critical levers, and they were that, firstly, stakeholders need to debate on and agree upon what this inclusive education should look like in practice. Secondly, to review and rationalize the current resource allocation mechanism. And thirdly, to agree upon the minimum levels of service provision to support inclusive education. In May 2017, the Ministry of Education, Science and Culture formed a steering group with collaboration of all stakeholders from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Local Government, the Association of Local Authorities, the Teachers Union, the Head Teachers Union and Upper Secondary Schools, the Teachers University, and the National Home and School Association. The group will work together through the year 2019 and hopefully longer. To follow up on the first critical lever, the Ministry of Education invited all parties that participate in the debate of inclusive education with over 40 meetings all over Iceland in the autumn of 2018. This was a major success as the voices of all parties were heard. Such an operation has not been implemented in Iceland before, and it is very valuable for all parties. Soon, a final report from these meetings will be handed over to the Ministry of Education for further decision-making and on future work, which will focus especially on cross-sectoral cooperation. A follow-up on the second lever. The plan is to start a pilot project to review the allocation mechanism in 4 municipalities in Iceland. One of the conclusions of the audit work was that Iceland's general education system is relatively well resourced, as expenditure on education is higher than other OECD countries. However, the current funding processes are seen as a barrier to developments in inclusive practice, and therefore the work will focus on redirecting funding mechanisms away from compensatory support approaches towards those underpinned by intervention and prevention approaches in order to increase the system capacity to be equitable, efficient, and cost-effective. The process is to aim to reduce the use of formal needs identification procedures that involve labeling of learners and move towards throughput funding mechanisms that provide a wider range of support possibilities in schools for all learners. The steering group has not yet followed up on the third critical lever on agreeing up on the minimal levels and service provision to support inclusive education. The ideal timing to start the follow-up would be in 2020, and hopefully the stakeholders will agree upon taking this very critical lever into consideration and start working towards it from the year 2020. The steering group has worked in close cooperation and has had solution-based conversation and focuses on proactive mechanisms. Such an interministerial and cross-sectoral work is now consolidated on all levels in more and more sectors in Iceland, and it has changed the thinking, working, and practicing in many important fields. More importantly, such cooperation is led by the ministers in the Icelandic government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, I think, a very informative set of remarks sharing the process in Iceland around getting all parties on board and really emphasizing in your remarks the importance of a cross-sectoral approach to inclusive education. I thought it was also an interesting point around the expenditure in Iceland around education is higher than most OECD countries. And then I think you raised something that perhaps we hadn't heard before, and that, you know, it's important to look at equitable, but very important to look at efficiencies, the efficiencies around it, and accessibility. So thank you very much. We will go to our next speaker, who is Avin de Granis. And Avin is from the Norwegian Association of Youth with Disabilities from Norway. So Avin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thanks also to the Permanent Mission of Sweden and the Nordic Council of Ministers for hosting this very important side event. My name is Eivind de Granes, and I work as an advisor at the Norwegian Association of Youth with Disabilities, which is an umbrella organization that represents over 25,000 disabled youth. When it comes to Norway, from our perspective, the legislation within the field of education is mostly quite well. The Education Act establishes a universal right to inclusive education, as well as an individual rights to adaptation for pupils with disabilities. However, while we've come far, there are still some challenges that is important to take note of. Perhaps the largest challenge in Norway is that there are such a great difference between municipalities when it comes to implementation of the legal rights, which was mentioned by Thomas earlier. So we see a discrepancy between having a right on paper and being given a right in practice. And this is also an overarching concern which we in the civil society raised to the CRPD committee in the recent hearing of Norway earlier this year. So as a consequence of this, in many municipalities, you see that there is a large and increasing level of segregation of disabled pupils outside of ordinary class settings, particularly pupils with intellectual or cognitive disabilities. At the same time, there is a lack of teachers with training in inclusive and adapted education, and many pupils receive their education from untrained assistants. And as a consequence, the quality of education, while in some parts of the countries is very, very good, and it's important to take note of that as well, in others it is poor. And there is also a great variation in the universal design of schools. Nearly 80% of schools, for example, cannot be accessed by many pupils with mobility impairments. So to sum up the challenges, we see a large gap between law and practice in Norway, and I think that will be important to address in the upcoming years. At the same time, there are several positive aspects as well, which is very important to mention. My impression now is that there is a great political will to create a more inclusive education system. And there are several key processes which are undergoing to ensure more inclusive education, or to put place inclusive education on the agenda, which we are looking forward to. One of these is the 10-year strategy plan for equality of disabled people, which came out last year. And there's also an upcoming action plan where education is one of the key priorities, and we're very happy to see that. There's also an expert group which will revise the Education Act, and an upcoming white paper on inclusive education will come in the fall. And I also want to mention some interesting work that is being started by the Norwegian government to ensure universal design of schools, which aims to systematically move towards universal design of schools within 2030, and that is the roadmap for universal design of schools. So we're really looking forward to that process, and we are, of course, I'm not aware of any funds being allocated to this so far. So we, of course, are hoping to see some funds in the upcoming national budget of 2020. So we can talk about that afterwards, maybe.
Yes, let's take that offline.
But to kind of go back to the general part, and I just want to reiterate that one of the key strengths, I think, to the Norwegian system is that civil society is very much being included in many of these processes which affect us in the education sector. So from my perspective, there is a genuine interest from the government to consult us and to have a dialogue, and I'm very glad that we have that. So while we acknowledge that Norway has come a long way, we're also looking forward to continuing this dialogue and moving forward towards a more education system which is fully in line with the CRPD. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Arvin, for underlining the fact that Norway has really come a long way, but there remain some challenges, and similar to the intervention made by Thomas, the importance of operationalizing legislation and making sure that that actually finds itself in the classroom. And I thought it was interesting that all the speakers have raised the important role of municipalities, and that's something we might want to discuss if we have some time for question. And I think we all look forward to seeing the Norwegian white paper on inclusive education that you said is forthcoming. We're going to now go to our next speaker, Magnus Lagerkrantz from the National Agency for Participation in Sweden. Magnus, over to you.
Yeah, we have 10 less municipalities than Finland, but it's basically the same. But I would like to give a little bit of an overview of the Swedish system. You heard Nora explain a little bit more how it was, and I can take the theoretical parts of it. But then also go into some challenges that I think is important. Just as Norway and Finland, Sweden has a pretty strong legal framework. We have a school law that says that everyone is to have equal access to education. It feels good to be in New York and also say that we have a school law that actually also says that the education is to be formed aligned with human rights, and that the people who works in schools is supposed to promote human rights. So it's a strong legal framework in our school law. We also have, as Nora mentioned, we have in our law the right for students who have the need for it to get special support in different ways, often from a person or a resource in class, which is, of course, a very important aspect for many students with disabilities. But as Thomas and Eivind said, Sweden as well, we have a strong legal framework, and we also have strong municipalities. And the municipalities can have a large mandate to actually arrange and implement the regulations that are. And I think one of the big challenges that we have in Sweden is, as important as it is that it is a right to special support in the school law, it's not a universal solution for everyone, which is becoming a little bit of a, for example, we see an increasing amount of students with neuropsychiatric diagnosis and disabilities, and there's lots of numbers, and we shouldn't talk about statistics, but somewhere around 5 to 10% of the students, which means that it's not 1 or 2 students in every school, it's 2 or 3 in every class, which means that we need to move towards more universally designed schools. We can't solve all problems on an individual level with the students, so to speak. So I found one really good example, I would say, but it's from one school, so it's not. It doesn't. we can't say this is Sweden, sort of, but we can hopefully learn from this example. And they did they took their whole school and they tried to go from a change of perspective, from perspective where the setup is that the student is supposed to a setup where the student shall be able to. And then they took their whole educational environment and everything, and they looked at the needs of students with neuropsychiatric disabilities. And then they formed the school out from this outset, which means that these students did not have the same need for special support, and that the other students without disabilities were also benefited in this system. So I think it's important that we have special support, but I also think it's important that we move towards more of a universal approach to education and educational environments. We have also seen other examples where you provide assistive technology to all students in a class, which benefits all students, not just the ones that are disabled, which also could remove some of the stigma and aspects like that we have connected to these issues. I also think that a third really important part of this is, as other colleagues were talking about, is education to teachers, and not only the teachers that are working in special needs education, that all teachers get a higher knowledge of methods and tools for a more universal approach to education. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you for staying in your time. You raised the point around special support as a right. Again, strong municipalities, strong law, maybe not as strong enforcement and practice, again, in the classrooms. The importance of looking at universally designed schools and then using technology as an equalizer. I thought that was a great point. Now we're going to pivot to Mia Mudik, and Mia is from Equally Unique Sweden. Mia, over to you.
I am from Equally Unique, an organization in Sweden, and we share a lot of experiences in the Nordic countries, as many of us already have said. And we in Equally Unique, we work for a better school for everybody, for all children, also children with disabilities. They should have the same education as everybody else. According to the convention and also the Agenda 2030 SDG 4. It's important that Sweden is active in working in a progressive way. We have good examples, but we can also see that there are a lot of challenges that we need to address. As Nora just said, students with disabilities, they often don't have the same opportunities to choose schools as everybody else. In Sweden, there is a problem because schools have the right to not admit children with disabilities due to economical expenses. And the government's own authority, the National School Agency, Educational Agency, they have done a review that says that 40% of the school do not solve the easiest things that children with disabilities need to be able to access the educational system. For example, to go on school excursions with their classmates. And we in Equally Unique, we say that there are solutions. Sweden must invest funds, special funding to those schools that work according to these needs. The Swedish government has an investigating commission that has written a 350 pages long report with a strategy for the future school. In these 350 pages, there are only 17 lines that mention children with disabilities, and 0 times it is mentioned within an accessible school environment for these children. So we want to raise this as a learning example of how to not do in the future. We say that there are solutions. It's not so difficult. If you work towards a future strategy, then in the work groups and in the investigation, there needs to be representatives from the civil society, not only in reference groups, to be able to answer questions from the investigations team. They actually need to participate. Equally Unique have 3 areas that we work with in Sweden. It's accessibility in the schools. And with accessibility, we don't only look at the classroom settings, just as Magnus said, and Nora and Thomas and a lot of the other speakers have said. It's about, we need to see the entire educational setting as a whole. We need to be able to adjust the teaching materials for every student, to see every student's needs, and also see that they have access to this from their first day in their educational career to achieve their objectives. There needs to be a good school and learning environment. Equally Unique works so that there should be a national support warranty so that the schools can see the children's need from the first day when they start school, so that they can attend on the same premises as everybody else. In a good learning environment, there needs to be competence with the principal, the teachers, and the school authorities about children with disabilities, but also how to work forward. It is also important to have a good learning environment, to have access to sign language education if you need that, or learning materials in Braille. That is not always the case in Sweden. We also need to work with a more student-focused way. We are all different. I think that we all in this room agree. And we need to work for a good learning environment that prevents bullying, so that children are not excluded in school because of their disabilities. That is also a way to prevent bullying. And lastly, I would like to conclude to say that it's very important that we have high expectations on the students with disabilities, so that they, in a better way, have the opportunity to sustain their objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia, for raising some very, very pertinent points, for sharing with us situations of children being denied access to education because of cost. I mean, somehow you don't expect that coming from Sweden. I think your point around more investment in inclusive education is important. You also raised a very critical point around the importance of bringing civil society to be part of problem solvers and really being part of the discussion. And then you touched on a point that I think we really have seen in many countries, is that you need a whole school approach. So competence of the principal, competence of the teachers, everybody needs to be on board. And then I think your point, your closing remark about making sure that we have high expectations for children with disabilities is really very, very important. So now we're going to move away from the Nordic. We're going to go to a place that's slightly warmer, and we're going to go to Kenya. And for Kenya, we have Regina Mwangi, and Regina is from Leonard, Cheshire Youth, and she's a youth leader in Kenya. So Regina, over to you. You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. As you have mentioned, I am a youth leader with Leonard Cheshire back in Kenya, and have been actively taking part in collecting data on education and how persons with disabilities are faring on in that area. So all youth with disabilities and even children, we believe that education is not only the key to success, but the key to a successful life. And we all have the determination to go to school, but more often than not, we are excluded because we have schools that are not disability friendly. Whether you are a deaf person, you are a blind person, or you are physically challenged, you find that the facilities and the infrastructures are not friendly for you. And I think that in this current and age, I shouldn't be worried of how to get to class. I should be worried of how to master the content that is being taught in class. But despite having the challenges, we have good practices that are taking shape. So through the project, the 2030 and counting, it was clear from the data that we collected that my country has tried to put some of the best policies in place, but like my Norwegian colleague mentioned, that we have these beautiful laws on the paper, but they do not match the reality on the ground. So legally you're protected, but you can't see any change on the ground. So that is one of the challenges that we are going through. But it's a best practice in that at least we have a law somewhere in place, and we would love to see it being implemented. We also recently have the introduction of the competency-based curriculum that is more inclusive than the previous curriculum, which basically aims at developing the competence of each and every individual. And we feel that disabled people are going to benefit from this curriculum more than the previous one. The current system of education that we have inclusive schools that accommodates all students despite having disabilities or not. We also have special units, and we feel that we would love more integrated schools so that we can learn together with students who are normal, because these are the people that we are going to face when we get outside the school, and these are the people we are going to work together. So it would be good to have that introduction early on in life. As Mia mentioned, that cost is another issue. So you can find that you have private schools that really accommodate for your needs, but your family you cannot really afford to take you to that school, and the school will turn you down and they'll tell you, we are sorry, we cannot really accommodate you. And that is really sad when you have dreams that you want to achieve through that. More often we have grown-up people, and we appreciate them, grown-up people making rules for us, making the laws for us, sitting in boardrooms and coming up with policies. But we feel that for solutions to be made, solutions that will really help young persons with disabilities and even children, we need to be involved in that table. We are experts in our own challenges. We understand it better, and we have an idea of what solution we need to see. So we need to be included at the table. Our voices need to be heard, and that is exactly what the 2030 and Counting Project is doing. And if you want to hear more about the 2030 and Counting Project, we welcome you tomorrow at Conference Room B at 3:30 p.m.
Thank you very much, Regina. And I don't think that needs any annotation. I think you said what needs to be said. We're going to go to our next speaker, who's Marcus Operanio. And Marcus is from the Philippines. He's also with Leonard, Cheshire, and is a youth leader in the Philippines. So, Marcus, you've got 5 minutes.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So, I sit here today as a person with disability who's a product of inclusive education and an advocate, and as someone who works for Leonard Cheshire Disability Philippines Foundation. So, Leonard Cheshire Disability Philippines Foundation is a non-stock, non-profit, non-government organization which works for the promotion and protection of the rights of people with disabilities in the Philippines. And we are a strategic partner of Leonard Cheshire. It's a UK-based NGO which works for the improvement of lives of people with disabilities in Asia and Africa. So in the Philippines, we have very good policies when it comes to education and the inclusion of people with disabilities. But we're very poor when it comes to the implementation of these laws. And this is where the support of civil society comes in. In my country, even being a young organization, we have pioneered an inclusive education program which aimed to provide children with disabilities equal access to quality education by working closely with educators, school authorities, families, the government, communities, in order to facilitate their enrollment into regular mainstream schools. Within the years of implementation of the inclusive education, through the generosity of our different funders, such as the USAID, Australian Aid, Save the Children, we have facilitated the assessment and enrollment of children with disabilities into regular schools. Part of the support was provision of assistive devices, capacity building to teachers and parents, support on school modification for accessibility, as well as awareness campaigns. Some of the positive effects and impact to children brought by the program were the following. First is the enhancing of educational and social skills of children and enabling them to be independent. Various project components were geared towards the enabling of children with disabilities and enhancing their educational and social skills in a learning environment that is barrier-free and disability inclusive. The assessments provided a baseline on addressing various vulnerabilities and determining the proper intervention for children with disabilities. Assistive devices enable the child to be independent in mobility and activities of daily living. Second impact is on the inclusive environment. Teachers were trained to provide better learning environment for students with disabilities, particularly in the regular school setting. These trainings will have a long-term effects in classroom management, sensitivity, inclusion, and school administration. Since in the Philippines, we have discovered that it is actually the teachers who's more resistant to inclusive education. Because of the special education, they tend to reject the child and enroll them in special education instead of enrolling them in the regular mainstream schools. So through our program, we have capacitated teachers for them to become more open in accepting children with disabilities. Third impact is for the social development. Group guidance and child-to-child activities were opportunities for children with disabilities to develop social skills and through a sensitive and facilitative approach. Through these activities, children gain confidence, very important to achieve their full potentials. Fourth impact on children of inclusive education was family development. Parent support group trainings and organizing activities capacitated parents to manage and become proactive change agents for their children. In the Philippines, most persons with disabilities, especially those who come from low-income families, are very dependent to their family members. It is very important to involve and capacitate families in order to promote a proactive approach in taking care and guiding children with disabilities. With these impacts, we have also discovered some of the challenges, and one of those is creating a wider network of partners and engaging stakeholders. Inclusive education is one of the concerns that is least given attention by concerned agencies in the Philippine government. Non-government and the private sector leading to the difficulty in establishing productive partnerships due to lack of organized groups and disability resource networks that are able to mobilize resources for children and persons with disabilities in general. Networking and collaboration with various entities, both in the government and non-government sector, are very important in providing access to education and support needed for children with disabilities, especially in nurturing a learning environment that is disability inclusive.
Marcus, I'm going to ask you to wrap up because we have two more speakers, I
right.
want to make sure the ambassador gets an opportunity.
Okay, so to wrap it up, we cannot achieve full inclusion of children with disabilities in regular mainstream schools if we cannot guarantee the participation of everyone, the parents, schools, and the community, the government, in ensuring that no one and no child shall be left behind.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And sorry to interrupt. Our next speaker is Mark Waltham from UNICEF, and Mark is the Senior Education Advisor. And you have 4 minutes.
Yeah. And apologies for being late. If I've only got 4 minutes, I'm going to speak quickly, if that's all right. So I work for UNICEF. We are all about the rights of children, ensuring the rights of all children, in my job, the rights of all children to education. And children with disabilities are a major component of that because from our figures, about half of all children with disabilities are out of school and therefore denied an education. As an intergovernmental organisation, UNICEF takes a particular approach to strengthening disability-inclusive education systems. So what we do is we always support the state education system run by governments in our partner countries. We don't conduct any parallel initiatives or anything that might clash or that would be unsustainable. So we are entirely focused on strengthening the whole education system. And that includes items at the service delivery level. If you can imagine in a school, we're particularly interested in making sure that teachers are properly trained, that school buildings are accessible, and that transport is laid on if necessary, and that learning materials are available for all children. And this is a big push by UNICEF. But even if you get everything right in schools, if you get the right teachers and the right classrooms and the right water and sanitation facilities and the right learning materials, still you won't get all children with disabilities into school because of discrimination and stigma within local communities. So we also work on the demand side of the equation, trying to address harmful social norms and stereotypes, and also trying to adjust the sort of the cost-benefit ratio that poor families often face. Is it worth sending my child to school if I'm convinced that they will not get a job in the future? So we try to address all of those. And finally, at the school level, we try and make sure that children don't go to school just to sit in the classroom, but they are there to learn. So we want to try and, we strive to try and make the curriculum, the school curriculum, inclusive, and things like exams, accessible or adaptations to exams. All of that, everything at the community level, is underpinned, of course, by what goes on at the sort of the government level, the enabling environment level. So we also help our partner governments to put the right resources in terms of leadership in inclusive education, in terms of finance, that's extremely important, in terms of the management capacity within the whole education sector for inclusive education, and to make sure that they've got the evidence, the data and the evidence on which to make sensible decisions, evidence-based decisions. We don't do all of this in all countries, but we do what is necessary. We work in 150-something countries on education programs. We don't do all of this in all countries. We take a sort of an opportunistic and needs-based approach. So we do some of these in most countries, depending on the needs and the opportunities in those particular countries. And that's about it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. So now I'm actually going to ask the Ambassador of Sweden, Olof Umskog, to make some closing remarks. What we'll do after his remarks, because he has to leave, is he will leave, and then we can stay and have a few more minutes for a round of discussion. I believe the room is only going to be used half an hour later, but we do want the Ambassador to be able to make some remarks and leave. Over to you, Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Yes, I do not want to stand in the way for what I think can be a very interesting discussion. But let me just say that first, I am the Swedish ambassador to the United Nations, and part of the role of the ambassador is very often to sum up conversations where you are the least expert in the room. And I think that's where I ended up today. So let me just take a little different approach to this and say that, you know, as a matter of fact, I think as a Swedish ambassador, and I think my colleagues from the Nordic countries, usually we are extremely proud to represent our countries in the United Nations, because we do stand up for human rights, for the dignity of the individual, for respect for international law, and to allow for civil society to have their voice heard, etc. I think those issues are very important. But I think there's also, and it's something that's been very clear today, I think, you know, that usually many countries in the UN seem to look at our societies as fairly successful in terms of finding the right balance between economic growth, social networks, etc. But I think it's very important what we've heard today from Nora, Mia, Thomas and others, that even in our countries there are serious challenges still to be worked on. And I think that is something very important in this global conversation we're having, that always being ready to listen to others, to learn from other examples, and that this road we're traveling together is never at an end. I think we are usually quite good, as what we've heard today. We have laws that are strong. but implementation is really the key. It's about resources, but I think it's also about a mentality, and I think that's what I picked up here today, putting ourselves in the shoes of those with disabilities. Many of you have spoken here today, and I think that has been missing quite often in our societies. So it's really useful to hear from all of you today on that. I think, I'm very proud that the Nordic Council of Ministers are putting this issue very high on the agenda in the Nordic context, and we're working with you and the World Bank and with UNICEF to ensure inclusive education globally. I think that, I just read a few numbers before coming here. 30 million children with disabilities in primary school, at the age of primary school, do not attend school. This is an amazingly, very depressing figure. And I think, again, in the global context, if we don't understand to invest in every child, we're not investing in the future of our own societies. So I think there's been some very useful advice here today. We do have also on the international level the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have the rights of persons, the conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And this morning we had the UNICEF board meeting, and we heard from the annual report that actually, in spite of all these conventions and sort of global legislation, the SDGs including, we are not able to reach the most vulnerable in the speed we would want to, and even in some respects we're flat in statistics or even going backwards. Some of that is partly because of conflicts and disasters, but still we need to do so much more. And again, I just felt that there was some very good advice and thoughts coming through today, including from both Regina and Marcus, from your respective perspectives. So again, we have a lot of work to do together, and I want to thank everyone for allowing us to have this conversation here today. It's inspiring, but it's also a commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and we're really grateful that you were able to stay with us for the whole part of this session. So what I will do now is open up for some questions and oh my goodness, okay, this is going to be fun. I'm going to start I'm going to go to the first hand that I saw. I already have 5 hands up, and I'm going to go with His Excellency from Jordan. Please introduce yourself and who your question is to.
My name is Mirad Raad Zaid Al Hussein. I'm the president of the Jordanian Higher Council for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here and to listen to all the speakers today. To tell you the honest truth, I've had very mixed feelings while listening to all the speakers today. Mixed feelings, why? Because I felt uplifted and inspired by what I've heard and what I know about the Nordic countries in particular. What a very highly sophisticated system you have for inclusive education. But feeling dismayed in a way as to the huge gap that exists between your countries and say the developing world. And my question is how can we bridge the gap, and especially if there are, as has been said, we have tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions of children with disabilities in developing countries around the world who are sitting at home twiddling their thumbs and not being educated. And so what is the solution, or what can the Nordic countries do to help bridge the gap? I think there is there is a lot that can be done, and I wish that there could be maybe a roadmap that could be worked on, or some sort of a I think the expertise that you have is so tremendous, and I think that there's a lot that countries around the world can do, can benefit from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Please.
I'm Carlos Rios. I'm from Human Rights Watch, and I would like to ask all speakers what their views are on homeschooling. Now we have a project in Brazil that they want to introduce homeschooling, and I was wondering if you could give us your perspective on should the parents of children with disability have the option to decide if they should go to a special school or homeschooling and not sending them to regular schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos, for a very crisp and direct question. I'm going to go to this side of the room, and I'm going to recognize Richard, and I'm going to recognize Sam. Please keep your questions short.
We put out the Global Summit last year. There weren't enough copies, but if people are interested, it's on our website, worldofinclusion.com. My question is really, having been engaged with this since we formulated Article 24 here some 12 years ago, the lack of progress around the world is a really big issue, and I do think we're going backwards. Part of it was the 2008 financial crash, which meant that there was cutbacks in public spending, but also a lack of capacity building amongst educationalists. If you look at the wording, and I'm coming to a question in a moment, if you look at the wording of the Convention, Article 24, and General Comment number 4, they do not mention special education. It is not there. It is not mentioned, and it's not mentioned on purpose, because we were going down a different route from special education. We're going down the route of developing inclusive pedagogy, with all that entailed, and some people have explained that very well. So do the panel, and anyone who wants to can answer this, think that we really need to enhance our efforts to make this point. I know that the CRPD committee had that in mind when they did the General Comment number 4, but still, countries are still being found to be totally inadequate, whether they're rich or poor, on their actual attempts to do this. Thank you.
My question relates to something that seemed to cut across the Nordic country and also Kenya. The whole question of good policies and legislations that are not implemented. I think we need to understand and help us to understand what we could do about this. In Kenya, you will be told that it is the issue of the resources. And you have talked about Norway, you have talked about structural access barriers. We would expect that in countries like Norway, we would not be talking about structural barriers in relation to inclusive education. So we would like to know why would we be talking about structural barriers? This is what we say are the problems in the developing countries. My name is Samuel Kabuye. I am one of the members of the CRPD committee, and we are recognizing these issues of good intentions which are not carried through. And in the least developed countries, as I said, the issues are said to be resources. What are the key problems in the Nordic countries? And we all look to the Nordic countries as examples of what we should follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reiterate the questions and then ask the panelists to we'll go around, and just if anybody has to say something on each one of the questions, let's do that. Please keep your responses brief so we can come back to another set of comments and questions. So there was a question on how do we bridge the gap. There was a question on homeschooling. There was a question on the lack of progress and the emphasis around how do we really pivot to inclusive pedagogy in spite of all the frameworks and conventions that we have. And then I think the last point was really around what are the blockages around legislation enforcement, and how does that link to some of the structural barriers? So those are the 4 questions that I've kind of tried to truncate. And if there are any takers at the table, oh, lots of takers. So let's start with Magnus, and we'll come to you, Mark, after that.
I think in Sweden we have, you talked about the general comment number 4, and I think this distinction between inclusion and integration is an important factor, that we have strived towards integration without the actual part of inclusion. We called it inclusion, but we strived for integration, which I think is one key aspect, which actually points to knowledge, that it's a knowledge-based challenge. So I think we have a challenge to actually fill inclusion with the semantics, the correct semantics, which is not equal to integration, which probably also leads a little bit to the homeschooling question. What I would say, I would have a hard time saying that homeschooling is close to inclusion or integration at all. So, but that's our experience of it. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm going to answer 2 questions. So the first one is closing the gap. So from my point of view, the key things needed to close the gap are, firstly, leadership from countries. People need to be committed to inclusive education. And the second one, of course, is money. And the money doesn't have to come from the country. Most countries could do with putting more money into their education systems, but rich countries need to chip in as well. So the richer countries also need to contribute. And I've also got an answer to the question about homeschooling and Richard's point, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, General Comment 4, makes it clear that inclusive education means all children in the same classrooms, in the same schools. Governments that have signed up to the CRPD have a responsibility to put that in practice. It doesn't mean that all children have to take up that opportunity. If they choose to do something else, they can do something else, but they can't be stopped from all learning in the same classrooms, in the same schools.
Thank you, Mark. That was very clear. I think we got the response to that, and I think Richard is very happy. Okay, so now we're going to go to Mia. Mia?
Not attain an equal education. And I think that it's about attitudes in the society in all different levels. From when you are born, if you have a disability until you reach your adult age, that is a problem that we need to address. I don't know, I don't have the answer on how, so that is something that I would like us all to take back home and continue working with. And when it comes to education, this is something that we also need to think about. In Sweden, the last 6 months, we see different reporting that children are sitting at home. They don't even go to school. They don't attend school, maybe because they have a neuropsychiatric diagnosis, or that the teachers in the school have difficulties in addressing these children. And I agree that we need to have a school system that is adjusted to all children and meet all children's needs, but all children are different. So that is really challenging on how we can meet all these different needs. We need to have that in mind when we design the schools. Some children need to have a quiet environment. Some children need to be so physically active to learn. So I think that we need to see this in a broader perspective and not think that everyone can attend the same classroom setting.
Thanks. Is any comments on this end? Mina?
bridging the gap. So I would say that much of my work has to do with finding the good balance between trust, responsibility, and self-evaluation, and assessment, follow-up, impact analysis, and sometimes control.
Okay, so on that note, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this to close. It's been a great panel. I think it was ambitious to get so many people on the panel to all talk, but we've gone a bit over time, but I think having the questions was very important. So thank you all very much, and let's keep this on. Bye-bye.